An assault on human rights in Indonesia? Proposed new laws provoke nationwide anger. Protesters say the legislation will weaken anti-corruption efforts as well as affect sex before marriage, abortion, and gay rights. Can the outrage stop the government's plans? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Extramarital relations outlawed in Indonesia, and jail sentences for insulting the president. They are some of the controversial proposals causing an outcry in the world's largest Muslim majority nation, which are considered disastrous by rights groups. Thousands of students vented their anger. Coming under pressure, President Joko Widodo postponed the vote on changes to the draft criminal code. But Indonesians still fear it could be passed by parliament. They're also angry over the passing of another law that weakens Indonesia's anti-corruption organization. The protests have been dismissed by the Indonesian government.
With the delay based on the government policy to listen to the voice of the people, the actual demonstrations conducted to reject the draft law are no longer relevant and not important anymore.
Some of the issues covered by the proposed law include consensual sex outside marriage punishable by a year-long prison sentence and in up to 6 months for unmarried couples who live together. All same-sex relations effectively considered a crime, prostitutes could face the threat of prosecution. Women could face 4 years in prison for having an abortion, unless it's a medical emergency or the result of rape. Punishment, too, for anyone convicted of insulting the president, religion, and state institutions. The existing blasphemy law would be expanded, and Indonesians associating with Marxist-Leninist ideology face a 10-year prison term. All right, let's welcome our guests to the show. In Melbourne via Skype, Greg Barton. He's an expert on terrorism at Deakin University. In Washington, D.C., Calvin Dark, a former Indonesian government campaign advisor. And finally, also in Melbourne by Skype, is Damien Kingsbury, a conflict resolution specialist. Welcome to you all. Damien, let me start with you. Just how significant have these protests been?
Well, I think they're very significant because what they're showing is a popular backlash against very conservative changes, proposed changes to Indonesian legislation. They're showing that these changes are not necessarily supported by the people and that they are really reflecting a minority view within Indonesia.
Calvin, there have been discussions on changing Indonesia's criminal code since independence in the 1940s. So why is all this happening now?
Well, I think part of it is there is a growing level of conservatism, at least religious and moral conservatism within the government. But also I think that part of the reason for the protest is that in addition to the reforms that have kind of gotten newsworthiness because of the bans of sex outside marriage and other things like abortion, it takes away a little bit from some of the other reforms, like taking away some of the autonomy of the corruption agency. And I think that that's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it isn't good that this has been reduced to these what many would consider obscure morality laws here in the West. But it also is good because I don't know if we will be talking about what I think is probably more important, the corruption bodies stripping of autonomy, if it wasn't for those more sensational things.
Greg, President Widodo has ordered a delay, and lawmakers have been meeting, trying to figure out how to proceed. What do you think happens next at this point?
Well, the best outcome, and it's by no means certain, is that this bill doesn't get passed in its current form with the current parliament, but rather it waits for the new parliament, which is sworn in the end of next month. There are 628 articles in this new criminal code. Most of them are innocuous or very positive. There's about 20 that are problematic. And the hope is that those 20 will be stripped out. There's no reason for them to be there. They burden the code. They make it objectionable. The necessary reforms that come with the new code can go ahead without any reference to these objectionable articles. So that would be the sensible choice, but it depends upon President Widodo's political manoeuvring, because as president, he doesn't have absolute power. It depends on the parliament, and it's a hybrid system. No one really knows how this is resolved. So he's going to have to negotiate hard and be very wise to get that outcome. But clearly that's what the will of the people want. They don't want these draconian laws.
Damien, you heard Greg there talk about the possibility that maybe this doesn't pass this session of Parliament, maybe another version of these laws pass in the next Parliament. What do you think? How possible is that this won't happen now and perhaps it will be taken up in the next parliamentary session?
Well, I think I should start by saying I agree that the watering down of the Anti-Corruption Commission is probably the most important and most problematic part of this legislation. The morality legislation is troubling because it does indicate a growing conservatism, a populist conservatism within Indonesia. But the watering down of the Anti-Corruption Commission, I think, is really quite troubling because it does indicate that Indonesia is stepping away from significant reforms in that area over the past 2 decades. Its chances of passing now, I think, are up in the air. Certainly President Widodo has indicated that he's not supportive of all of the amendments in the bill, but his power, as Greg has noted, is quite limited, and he doesn't have much popular support in the legislature. So we need to keep in mind that whilst he can refuse to sign this into law, he can also come under very significant pressure and find himself in a very awkward position if he doesn't go along with what the legislature ultimately decides. So this is really quite unclear at this stage. I think it'll go back to the legislature and there'll be a reconsideration of a number of aspects of these proposals, but whether the most contentious parts go through or not, such as the watering down of the Anti-Corruption Commission legislation, that really is still up in the air.
Calvin, I saw you nodding, so I want to give you a chance to respond, but I also want to ask you, so many of the bill's opponents say that it expands conservative Islamic influence in the world's most populous Muslim-majority country, but this is a country that also has substantial Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist minorities. What do you think?
Well, I think that second point is key because, as you mentioned, some of those measures do raise serious human rights concerns for those religious and ethnic minorities. But one other thing, too, that I was thinking about is, you know, as far as the morality laws are concerned, you've had a lot of the supporters who, when asked how this would affect tourism or how would this affect how Indonesia is looked at, you know, outside, they've been very quick to say that the way the laws are written, this wouldn't really affect tourists. But you have to remember that even if it wouldn't specifically target tourists, that's going to discourage people from going, and that's going to definitely hurt Indonesia's economy. And I don't think that that's the best way to raise Indonesia's profile in an international community. So I think that's something, too, that the protesters are recognizing, that not only do these new or these increased morality laws not reflect what everyone wants in Indonesia, but they don't want the world to have a misrepresentation of what the country is about and what it wants to be.
Greg, how valid is the argument by critics of the bill that parts of this proposed bill prove that a more hardline interpretation of Islam is creeping into Indonesian society?
I think it's a very valid point. The point to understand is that Indonesian politics has dissolved into 2 coalitions. It's now a bipolar system, even though it's a very complex, messy, multi-party system without any clear conviction politics. The exception to that conviction politics thing is the Islamist parties, who are all in that coalition in opposition around Prabowo Subianto, the unsuccessful contender for the presidency. The parties supporting the president, on paper at least, should have no truck with these toxic articles, but these are being snuck in because these Islamist parties, which represent less than 1/5 of the parliament, couldn't get support in public through elections for such laws. They've bundled them up with this new criminal code, hoping they'll get through and they can pressure the president. So it really requires some strength from the president and from his coalition partners in parliament, because these are not laws that Indonesians have voted for. They've rejected the parties that push these ideas. They don't reflect the thinking of most Muslims in Indonesia, let alone non-Muslims. And it's not just non-Muslims who would suffer. It's likely lower middle-class, working-class women who will find these laws used against them to blackmail, to intimidate, to harass. So it's potentially very serious.
Damien, Islamic groups in Indonesia They're saying that these proposed changes to the country's criminal code reflect the character and personality of the Indonesian people and the nation. Are they accurate in saying that?
Well, it reflects the character and nature of some Indonesians. We've got to keep in mind there's always been a very conservative bent amongst some Indonesians going back decades. Islamism has been a popular stream within Indonesian politics and society amongst some Indonesians for a long time. It's never been in the majority, as Greg's pointed out. It's probably no more than 20% in electoral terms, but it's very influential, and most Indonesians will say that they're Muslims, even if they're not devout Muslim, and they're very unlikely to want to go against what puts them as Muslim precepts. So even though it's not something they would support or vote for, it's not something that many nominal Muslims would necessarily object to in public, because they don't want to be seen to be flouting Islam, if you like. So in one sense, and we've certainly seen this in Aceh, where quite nominal or moderate Muslims have been brought under the sway of the ulama, the religious class, who have brought in some quite draconian measures, and most Acehnese don't object to it simply because they don't want to be seen to be bad Muslims in that sense. So with populist conservatism, you can introduce, and there's a history of this globally, you can introduce quite unpleasant legislation which many people wouldn't necessarily support. But if it's introduced in a particular way which posits it as an either-or alternative, most people, or many people, possibly most people, would acquiesce. And that's going to be the real test here, I think, as to whether these legislators feel they can get away with this, and whether they're going to actually strengthen their political position by pursuing this particular path.
Calvin, you were speaking before about the perception of Indonesia, that if these laws were passed, how it would change people's thinking about Indonesia, whether they be tourists, whether they be residents. You know, critics of the bill say that it violates freedom of speech. They say that it discriminates against religious minorities, including women and LGBT people. So how concerned are different aspects of the government as to, if this bill were passed in its current form, what the rest of the world would be thinking about Indonesia?
Well, I think that's kind of a two-parted question. When you mentioned how, supporters within the government were saying this reflected what Indonesians wanted, in a way that's true, in that Indonesia's Muslims would not want to be standing up against that particular kind of version of Islamic influenced law, even if they wouldn't want to impose it on someone else. There's one thing to practice something yourself when you're home and to believe. It's another to have your country's laws reflect that. And I think that the first priority of the supporters of these reforms is to institute that what they believe is law influenced by Islam as they believe Indonesians want it. But I also believe that they're have to be thinking in the back of their minds that Indonesia is not, it's not in a vacuum, that they have to interact with the world. And regardless of what they may believe about the laws and the reforms and the reasoning behind it, it's going to change people's perceptions for tourism, as I said, but also with business, because now businesses are going to have to consider how this will affect what they want to do, the people that they may want to bring to Indonesia to run their companies and do business there. So even though it may not be something talked about by the supporters, they've got to be thinking about that, because that's the economy.
Greg, critics also say that this bill would reverse liberal reforms that were enacted after democracy was restored in 1998. I mean, what do you say to that?
Look, I think they've got a very good point in making that criticism. Bear in mind, we're not talking about just a few people potentially being victims. There are tens of millions of Indonesians in stable marriages who don't have the legal documents for those marriages for various reasons, perhaps because of their religious status or because they're simply poor and don't have the necessary paperwork. They could become victims. No one in Indonesia really wants, well, I say no one, the vast majority of people don't want to see democratic reforms wound back. They believe in democracy even though they don't trust their politicians or their parties. They want a free and just society, and a society that hands over moral policing to politicians and literally to police it becomes an illiberal society, even if it's only legislation on paper that's seldom applied. I think people recognise that. They were a bit slow to recognise the threat to liberal democracy in Indonesia, and that's why we're seeing these very energetic protests.
Damien, officials have said that prosecutions of foreigners under the bill are unlikely. Of course, this is one of the things that's generating a lot of headlines when it comes to the news coverage of this. Officials have said that there would have to be not only proof that extramarital sex had happened, but also a complaint from a family member or a witness. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that's actually the case? Would it be unlikely that foreigners would be prosecuted if this law were to pass? Or do you think it's a distinct possibility that we could see that?
Well, I think going back to Kelvin's point that there's certainly many Indonesians who'd be concerned about the economic impacts. But having said that, Indonesian politicians historically have always been quite insular in their perspective, inwardly focused, not outwardly focused. So what the world thinks is probably very much a secondary consideration in this regard. I've been trying to get my head around how this would work in practice. And if we look at, say, a classic tourist destination like Bali, and you'd say, well, that couldn't possibly be affected. There's too many tourists, particularly young Western tourists who go there who may not be married. What we know from police activity in places like Bali is that they will often be involved in the setting up of people in supposedly criminal activities, arrest them and then extract an amount of money in order for the process not to be pursued. So it's essentially a corrupt process. It would be very easy for people working in hotels to essentially inform on unmarried couples sharing a bedroom, for police to then become involved and then say to this couple, look, you've broken the law, we're going to arrest you, take you down to the police station, you'll stay here and you'll have to go to court, and you will stay in jail until you face the court. Alternatively, you can pay a fine in cash up front now. And I think there's a very good chance that that could happen. So we know that the Indonesian police are in many instances quite corrupt. We know that they've engaged in this sort of practice before. I've been a victim of it personally before. Had to pay an so-called on-the-spot fine in cash for a minor traffic offence. This is absolutely consistent. I think it really is a big problem. But the major concerns really, the moral issues, yeah, I think that's problematic. But the watering down of the Anti-Corruption Commission goes to the heart of the state. The proposed bans on speaking out against the president and state institutions go to the nature of politics in Indonesia. It sounds very much like what we had under the so-called New Order regime of President Suharto before democratisation, when you couldn't criticise the president. If they go back to not being able to criticise the president or state institutions, then the opportunities for people to express legitimate concerns about real political problems in the country will be very much limited. And that will apply to the media, of course. And I think that really does start to seriously impact on the type of political society Indonesia is becoming.
Calvin, in the first part of his answer, Damien was discussing the situation in Bali. Of course, Bali is a huge tourist hotspot. There is concern about what all this would mean for Bali. So I want to ask you to expand on that, because the deputy governor in Bali has been quoted as saying, if possible, articles which are sensitive to our lives in Bali can be reviewed or eliminated. I mean, do you think that we would see that happen if the bill in its current form progresses, either in this parliamentary session or the next one? Could we see exceptions made when it comes to how the law might be applied in Bali?
Yes, I think in the case of Bali, it's very likely that if these laws do go into effect, that there will be exceptions, either actual exceptions in the law or exceptions in the way that the law is carried out. But I think probably the bigger picture is the chilling effect that these laws have in places, like Bali, but also this reaches to the Anti-Corruption Agency. The common thread amongst all those reforms is to have that chilling effect. You don't have to actually enforce the law. Just knowing that that law is there, it's going to, for religious and ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community, tourists, knowing that's there is going to have a chilling effect on the way that they enjoy or decide to visit Indonesia or do business there. It will also can be used as a pretext, as we were just saying, so that the law could be there so that if there are other, say, human rights violations or people that they want to silence or people that, they believe are acting contrary to the government, that they can use these laws as kind of an excuse. So I think the chilling effect from the laws is there, whether or not they're enforced or if there are exceptions in places like Bali.
Greg, so the bill apparently doesn't explicitly outlaw homosexuality, but there is a growing concern that the criminalization of extramarital sex and new obscenity laws could, in the future, form a legal basis for persecuting gay people. What do you think about that?
Well, that's absolutely the case, and not just in the remote future. If the code goes through, then it's illegal to have sexual relationships unless you're married to your partner. And if you're gay, that's not an option. You can't get legally married. You can get married abroad, perhaps, and come back home, but it wouldn't be recognised. So the fact that you identify as LGBT means that you're a sitting duck for persecution, for intimidation, for shakedowns, particularly higher profile people. But it's just a nasty, pernicious piece of legislation that could have immediate effect. That's one of the direct consequences. And, this is so much at odds with what 2 decades of consolidation and democracy in Indonesia has been about, what people have been voting for, and particularly what for young Indonesians. This is a very young nation, median age of 29. That's why we're seeing such heated outbursts. And as we've heard, also, people are very proud of the work that the Anti-Corruption Commission has been doing, and they don't want to see that challenged either. They just don't understand why these retrograde steps. They don't seem necessary. No one's asking for them, and they're very dangerous.
Damien, if the bill were to pass, local authorities would get greater freedom to introduce punishments for breaches of customary laws that aren't currently covered in the penal code. I know that we've spoken a little bit about these other issues throughout the show, but could you specify more about what exactly that would mean, what kind of power these local authorities would now have to impart different types of punishments?
Well, that's an open question because customary law by definition isn't codified. So it does create all sorts of problems about what is or what becomes illegal, what is acceptable, what is not. And with customary law, we know that in other places where it has been applied, that it can be used by people who wield power in a local community, for example, who can become the arbiters of customary law. And it can be used as personal punishments or retributions. It can be used to enhance or strengthen the status or the positioning of particular individuals in social settings or economic settings. So customary law is, in many respects, quite problematic. Not to say that there aren't elements of customary law which can't be applied, but unless they're codified and very clearly codified, then determining what they are and how they should apply, it becomes a very grey area, and that's not consistent with the equal and consistent application of the rule of law. But look, I think the bigger question here is, why would the legislature in Indonesia be considering passing this type of legislation in the first place? What is going on in Indonesian politics at the moment which leads the legislature to actually seriously contemplate this sort of draconian legislation, which certainly has a moral element to it, but also has a very distinct regressive political element to it? And I think that marks a real shift in Indonesian politics, a real division, which we saw in the last presidential election to some extent, but a real hardening of positions, a polarisation, if you like, and
Damien,
perhaps even a challenge to the authority of the president.
Damien, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have run out of time, so we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Greg, Barton, Calvin Dark, and Damien Kingsbury. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, and And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.